Good afternoon, everybody. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Associate Professor Mike Liddell, one of the founders of science at JCU in Cairns. He started here over 25 years ago. And I think we have, for many of us who came much later, we have a lot to thank him for getting this university established in Cairns. Thank you. So Mike shifted his focus. Mike is a chemist, and he began his career in both industrial and theoretical chemistry. But when he came to Cairns, he moved into environmental chemistry, and that's where I overlap a little with him or work with him. Over the years, over his years, he's published in a wide range of areas, in ecology too, I think, and phenology in various areas. In 2000, Mike set up an eddy covariance tower at Cape Tribulation, and that's where our interests overlap. And he also set up another tower at the Daintree Discovery Centre in Cow Bay in 2008, and in 2010 established a very significant TERN ecosystem process site at Robson Creek in Atherton. And since 2017, Mike has been the Australian representative on the steering committee of the International Long-Term Ecological Research Network. And today he's going to speak to us about his research at the Daintree Rainforest Observatory. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. So thanks very much to Yoko and to Bill for asking me to present at TESS. It's actually a while since I last presented at TESS. Back in the day, and this is going to be a very informal presentation today. We used to have a requirement that TESS members used to have to give a short speech. And so every year I'd knock up a little short one. It wasn't any of this in vogue sort of 3-minute stuff. It just had to be snappy, and you would get chased with a gong if you were too slow. So I went back through those records, and then they sort of stopped when we entered a new era. So I picked through some of those early ones. And the reason I've had to do this is because when Yoko originally asked me, I was going to give a talk on eddy covariance fluxes, and it was going to be on the data from Cow Bay. I know that I've got some problems with some of the data in there, and it was going to be a good excuse for me to sit down and process data for several weeks or so intensively. But of course, teaching and administration got in the road, as they always do at JCU, and that clean time never sort of came. And then I looked at my calendar and went, oh God, I'm on another one of these forced recreational leaves. I've got no time. It's just not going to happen. What will I do? So I decided I'd talk on the DRO. And give everybody a bit of an overview of what's been going on from my perspective over the years. I've stolen graphics from all over the show. There's not a reference correctly to any of them as I go through. So if you recognise any of these things, I'm paying homage to your high-quality image that I've stolen from you. The insert on the left then gives a little vision of how we view the canopy crane back in the day. So it was called the Australian Canopy Crane Research Station when I first visited. We didn't own the land. It was at that stage, it was one of these rents from the Coconut Beach Resort next door, and it cost the uni $1 a year or something like that. The choice of the research station was because it was great for invertebrates. Okay, that was the number one mission, because Nigel Stork, the guy behind the crane, was an invertebrate specialist. So eventually then the land was purchased. Michael Bird came up with a great idea of calling it the Daintree Rainforest Observatory, and that got duly some significant funding. So I'm going to talk about that period then from at the start with a very simple facility back to where we are now with a complex one. So the crane then has obviously been a central feature from the outset. This image here gives a little bit of a picture of where exactly I've been located. I'm just trying to get this. If this thing points or not, but anyway, you get the idea. At that point there, that's where I've been playing over the years. Now, I dug back into some old records at home and found some pictures from when I drove up there the very first time. So it was a gravel road back in the day. So this is what the road used to look like. Not super hairy, but it was still a gravel road. And this is me driving into the station back then. Now, I'd forgotten at the start there wasn't even the buildings where the accommodation was. There was just the generator shed. That's the generator shed, the old one for the crane there. And when I came in then was after the cyclone, it's probably about April. So the cyclone hit in February 1999. Crane went in 2 months before, okay? So the legend has it that the bolts at the bottom of the crane were stretched, okay, a little bit. I don't know whether that was true or not, but certainly the forest was trashed. So here's all the forest sitting over the base of the crane tower. There's some pictures of mine, this one up here of the crane with all the denuded vegetation, some other shots from Steve, I think, over here. But then, you know, things got tidier again. This is the accommodation complex from the old Blue Festiva parked outside it that I used to drive up to for many a year. The leaf air index changed quite a lot. This is what it looked like after that cyclone had gone through. So category 3, it was about, 5 k's down south of the site when it hit, and it then significantly altered the leaf air index initially. So the progress then from that very simple accommodation complex, so this is what I was used to in the early years, where we had a number of beds and simple dongas. There was no ventilation in these things, so we added some ventilation. This is where we used to do presentations for open days for many years in here. Peter Burns, who still hangs around in the Daintree, if you go hunting it long enough, you probably bump into him. He was the manager at one stage. So that's developed then into what is now the very significant facility that's present at the DRO. So this was my last trip up the week before I went on leave, and this was the busiest I have ever seen the DRO other than the open day to open it. So there was an Indigenous group there that day, and they had completely filled the main car park right down to the forest, and this is the overflow of vehicles out the front. And apparently the next day it was going to be just as busy. So it's changed. In the early days, like we had barely 1 or 2 researchers usually was all we'd ever see. And nowadays we have lots of people there. So at the start then I was involved with eddy covariances. How did I get into this? Remember, I'd start off as a synthetic chemist in a lab with the glasses, the gown and all of that sort of stuff, remote from this. See, I had to move into environmental stuff. I was working with some organics and sugarcane and stuff like that. And then I bumped into a physicist that we had working called Simon Robson, who had the only honours graduate in physics, this guy here, Dave. So Dave then did his honours here, went down to UQ, did a PhD in physics, and at JCU he decided that he would look at eddy covariance fluxes over sugarcane and rainforest. Now, it was a pretty new area back then. So we managed to get the gear to do this on a grant. So I was involved with writing a grant that got that and some other gear. And Dave then put it up as a very short-term project. Okay, so ran it over sugarcane for some month or so, got some decent fluxes. We took it up to Cape Trib. We fabricated a few bits of aluminium, okay, and hung the gear out. After Dave finished his honours, we went, well, so what do we do with it now? And I decided to pick it up and run with it. The initial status of the instrument was very basic. Jamie in the back will recognise this is a 23X logger. This is way back in the day. This is an old Toshiba that had an incredibly small amount of memory in it. We used to try and collect then data at 20 hertz. So there's quite a lot of variables collected. To do that on an old piece of computer like this, where eventually the screen peeled off and it became that old, was quite a challenge. So that, though, led to my involvement with OzFlux. We formed loosely at a number of early meetings and then formally developed through TERN, and there's a publication that's coming through the system now where it's mentioned that, as you can see, Cape Trib was one of these early stations in the network. So Steve Turton, another early player up there, he actually set the first micromet station in place. He took those leaf air index photos. So Steve was a professor of geography here before he was made redundant a year ago. So he's now down in the Gold Coast, I think. So he was involved then at the outset a little bit with the micromet. Now, I shut down the flux station in 2019 when we resurfaced the crane up there. We had to take all of our gear down. At that point then, it just didn't become practical to put it back up when I'm running too many systems at once for the amount of manpower we've got. You might wonder about this barrier thing that you see here that's sitting underneath the flux gear. That's a practical thing. We had the crane drivers, and they've been arranged them over the years, We had the professional crane driver go on holiday to New Zealand one year, and the backup crane drivers who are postdocs, they got to look after things while he was away. So when he came back, it said it looked like the lawnmower had trimmed the top of the forest off. And although he'd promised me it was absolutely impossible that any driver would ever get the wire of the crane in and hit my gear, sure enough, they got it in and they bumped it into the sonic anemometer here and bent it a little bit. So at that point, then we fabricated this aluminium barrier underneath it to stop crane drivers coming in and bashing into our gear. So the fluxes then, I was lucky in the early years then, we went through this drought, this big drought in 2002, 2003, and the amount of rainfall that came in up there was well below normal sort of values. So looking at the wet season plus a period after it versus the dry season plus the extended dry here, there was this big change between what we'd normally see 3 metres or so and what we were getting in these 2 years. And that compounded with this extra dry season meant that the fluxes changed quite considerably. So that gave us a little story. We got a catalyst there talking about what was going on in the forest and this sort of phenomenon where what we find is that we end up with a lot of respiration, but because there's insufficient water, photosynthesis shuts up shop. It's been seen in really several places around the world now. So OzFlux then becoming a much more well-flourished sort of network by then, starts listing all the sites on a website that CSIRO developed. Now, I got in there, I'd managed to generate results. I'd managed to get some publicity. So I'm not sure exactly how, but I ended up getting a project inside what was one of the, I think, the first surf project. mansurf was, again, I think the largest of the surfs. Marine and Tropical Sciences Research Facility, and I got to look after a project that was called Climate Change Scaling from Trees to Ecosystem. And in that project then, I had Peter Franks at the start looking at ecophysiology of trees. I had Paul Nelson looking at soils, water. I had Carolyn Gross come in from UNE looking at phenology. And Peter and I were looking after how to scale this thing using modelling. And then we had Nigel Stork and postdoc involved with looking at invertebrates. So it's a mixed bag of things, all focused on how we could deal with looking at a process-based understanding of the forest up there. Now, Nigel was the Chief Executive Officer of the Rainforest CRC. Rainforest CRC was involved with running the crane at that point. So it was a consortium, involved JCU, UQ, QUT, and the Rainforest CRC then was really the lead in making everything happen. The mansurf ran from around 2006 to 2010, and out of that then I got to work with a lot of science people. So Peter Franks then, who's putting the band onto the tree here, the Andromeda band, he was an ecophysiologist. He left JCU to go down to University of Sydney, and Will Edwards joined the crew and took over Peter's part of the work. As part of this, I started to meet a lot of ecophysiologist people. So we had Greg Asner visit the site. Now, Greg was a young guy back then who was working out of Carnegie Mellon, based in Hawaii as well. And Greg was going around looking at this backpack control for controlling satellites with him. And he was looking at how to use pigment chemistry with satellites to infer information on what was going on in forests. So there could be tracking invasives, looking at productivity, a range of different things. So I helped him get going up there. Then we've got Owen Atkin and a lot of players with his team, again, looking at respiration. And so starting to work with all of these ecophysiologists made the forest look a lot interesting to me. So I started to get in the mix and do stuff as well. So there's the first sat flow measurements from up at the site. So we had a German colleague testing out his gear up there. Later on, we had Peter Heitz testing out some Czech gear up there. And we helped these guys keep the systems running. So any covariance flux systems use electronics, and trying to keep electronics running in a rainforest is always lots of fun. So we started to have some experience and became useful to other folks. Now, because I'm involved with plants then, I get to work with some plant people. So you see Susan there setting up the plot properly. So at the start, I looked at the plot that had been originally censused, and I forget which one of the botanists was involved with doing the initial census, but it appeared that there was a few dodgy things with the initial ID work, and certainly the way things were done was very suboptimum. So I introduced them to Rick Condit's book and tried to get them to do things properly for the next round of the census operation. And then Susan took that circular plot and turned it into a square plot, and it's got better over time. You know, I think this is the thing with these plots, you know, the experience of the people involved. And out of that, you know, I ended up having a few forestry students come in. So the guy smoking here is the French one, and he was joined by a Brazilian one, Otavio, and they got looking at the forest biomass with me. As forestry students, they wanted to chop down a lot of things. They were very enthusiastic about trying to actually chop down things to measure them, but I sort of weaned them off that idea. Nice picture here from Peter Heights, again looking at change in the plants over time. Now, then I moved to soils. Now, I'm lecturing in environmental chemistry. We have to talk about soils. Soils are very complex systems, so it's been great over the years to work with Paul. Now, Paul bought into the MetSurf on the condition he didn't actually have to physically do anything on site. He was so busy, he said, just make sure I don't have to do anything and it's good. You can put my name on it. So we did that for him, and he actually knew what was involved, because this is me and Cassandra digging the soil pit for the site. Now, we dug it with a pickaxe. Okay, we dug it till we died that day, and then after that we decided we really needed a little mini backhoe to somehow get into the forest and do it. Now, I'm seeing Susan and Yoga laughing because they know how bad it is trying to put soil pits in up there. We did go back and we measured the rock to soil ratio accurately by washing all the rocks and stuff, and it was insane. So that was a fun project that introduced me to soils practically. You know, we put in temperature probes, we put in TDR probes, we put in gypsum blocks to look at soil water potential, and we were able to aspirate the holes that we put in to look at soil dissolved organic carbon successfully as well. So working with soils people, then across we're looking at water. So I get involved with Michael Bird, and Niels as well has been up there in various times as well, looking at the stable isotopes up there. So again, it's a whole other world of people that I've been introduced to through having to run this project at the start. So we put in bores in there. The guy that was helping with the bores at that stage was a French guy, Marc Leblanc. He was actually trusting of the hardware, very trusting of the hardware, so that when we eventually got him up there to download the loggers, so we were using these loggers here, these are cheap and cheerful ones. They're fine as long as you keep an eye on them. Never trust them, okay, indefinitely. So 18 months was way too late. So by the time we went in, they nearly all died. Okay, so I took over the bores at that point as well. And over the years, you know, we've collected some decent data, and I've handed over to Michelle now how to run these things properly and some proper hardware to use. So the next project on the phenology, this was forced on us. So we didn't have a phenology project at the start, but the people running the MetSurf said that we really needed to move into this. So we got Caroline involved, who was an expert sort of in the area, and she helped us plan what we might do. We then had Bob Jago come in on it, and Bob was probably one of the lead field botanists around here for doing species ID. He was an amateur originally with the Douglas Shire Council and became extremely good. So if you go over to the herbarium, you'll find an inordinate number of specimens with the Jago flag sort of on them. So Bob said we should be using the sky rail rather than just walking around with binoculars, because he said you get a lot of repetitive strain injury from sort of steering with binoculars and stuff. Should be using the sky rail and the crane, because these are good ways of doing phenology. So we've done that then over the years. And Caroline said don't start looking at the data for at least 10 years. So fortunately, Nara's come along, and Nara has actually joined as an experienced phenologist at the start, and he's managed to turn some of this data that's been collected over the years in the same fashion into some reliable results that we can trust and publish. So Nara's generated a paper already on the palms, there's one on the community, and now we've got stuff with Skyrail, and Bill's come in the picture there because he's involved with what's going on in the liana side of the things at Skyrail. You know, these long-term data sets I've totally bought into. Once you start them, the key is just persistence. You know, you've got to be there. The interesting stuff will come as long as you can sort of hang in there for a long time. So that fifth project was around how to go from the small scale to larger. And so we started looking then at dendrometry, litter traps and stuff like that. So I was involved with putting the litter traps in at the start. So these are the litter trap locations. Now, at that point there, I had no experience of stinging tree at all. So there's a picture of a stinging tree up here. So in one of these corners here, there was a humongous stinging tree, okay? Now, I cut that thing down, and this thing was probably about, I don't know, 10 metres tall, cut it down by hand without ever touching a piece of stinging tree. I don't know how I ever did it. It was a miracle. At Robson Creek, Dan Metcalf introduced me to the stinging tree. We were picking a site for our tower for the fluxes, and he chose the most cyclone damaged piece of stuff where everything that you could potentially touch was either a live stinging tree or a dead stinging. And I eventually hit one man and went, oh God, I could have killed myself at Cape Trib if I'd known what I was cutting down. So we have had a lot, cyclone damage as you would expect. So putting the traps, Will then usefully came in and with Susan turned this into a paper. We were looking at litter fall over time, and that's continued, and it's continued to be a valuable component that contributes to the drought experiment. I've started working with modellers, quite a lot of modellers, and we've had an honours student, James Milner, who worked with a model calibrated for up there, and I'm still working with them regularly every couple of weeks in the UK, catching up, turning that into a model that we can use for that site. David, Deborah have been in the mix as well on the botanical side of things. So the key is the more that you work with people, the more productive I think you get over the years. Last one is our project on invertebrates. So Nigel's a lovely bloke. He's retired now, but he had a huge amount of energy and passion for invertebrates. You need it because in this case here, it was litter invertebrates. You're sorting through these things with the funnels. Then you're going into the lab and you're sitting down there with a microscope and you're IDing these things. And it is incredibly intensive work, I'd have to say. You see all of the invertebrate specialists doing it, and it's just very time consuming. You see over here a number of beetles, so we're doing a couple of experiments here. So there's a litter manipulation that I helped out with. But every time you're talking beetles, you're doing hundreds and thousands. That's what you're dealing with. So your stats are great because you really do have the numbers. So in that project then, we've had a whole people involved. Worth pointing out down there, so, Carl was a PhD student with Nigel. Cassandra was working for me running the mansurf project overall. She was also the crane manager sort of at that point in time. She left us to go down to Earthwatch, where she's been the CEO at Earthwatch now for nearly a decade. Okay, so Cassandra's been a really good value as well. Now, the thing about working at Cape Trib, it's always a nice place, okay? So in the early days, lunch breaks used to be down the beach. These days, I tend to go down a wet, and so I started writing this talk in there. It's a lovely place to do research, I'd have to say. So a thing though that made me quite sad was I finished the mansurf project and I headed overseas to visit other tropical forest sites because I'd only visited the DRO. While I was in Panama, I got the sad news there that Dick Cooper, who was the original crane driver, he died. So Dick was a very safety conscious guy, used to help me a lot with my work. But he was working on his own one day and he broke his own rules and it was a tragic accident. So they lived in this little house here. They were just due to retire and drive around Australia. It was literally a month before. And yeah, the uni was really, you can see there was fines involved in this stuff, but they really were missing in action. Like everybody working at heights needs to have somebody feel like somebody's looking over their shoulder. So when we were working at Robson Creek, so I was up there yesterday, we were there 2 weeks ago with the guys from Cairns Rope Access, checking to make sure that everything we did was to the letter, okay? And I guess when the accident happened, I started to be quite involved with the Canopy Crane Research Facility because the other institutions quickly jumped ship because they didn't want to have to do it. So UQ left, QUT left, down to JCU. And JCU then had to really bump the security, safety, all of that quickly. So I came in and was sort of running this thing with Nigel for quite a long period of time. When the accident happened, the VC was absolutely paranoid about anything else going on there. So all access to the crane was gone for a year. Now for me, electronics never runs without looking at it for a year. So I knew that I was in trouble. And sure enough, after a few months, the electronics failed. I forget what exactly. So plan B then was to set up somewhere else so I could keep measuring some fluxes and have some science happening. So I went down the road to the Daintree Discovery Centre. Met some very nice people who agreed that we could put a mast on top of their big tower. So it's a tourist tower sitting down at Cow Bay. It's in exactly the same forest. Soil's actually much nicer. There's no rocks, okay? But it's the same soil type. It's the same forest type. It's got the same amount of weight a while, it turns out, when you develop a census plot there, which is what we've done. And you'll see my protagonist down here is Nico. This is his dad. There have been two stars that have worked with me over many years now to help make stuff happen. So Nico's an electronics whiz from East Germany. His dad is a retired electronics engineer from Zeiss in Germany. So together they can do pretty much anything electronics-wise that they need to, because if Nico can't figure it out, his dad will reverse engineer it and tell him how to do it. So we keep working up there. This is now our second tower. So we had two towers in the Daintree. We collected data now over many years, which I'm sort of analysing. So we've got a replicate in the same thing, which has been good. So we're keeping this one running because the big advantage is we've got super stable comms to a little bit here. Things are never easy in the tropics. This is the invertebrates or the vertebrates, or we've never seen what, eating our sonic anemometer surfaces off. Every time it happens, it's at least 5,000 to ship them back to the US and get them fixed and sent back again. And it's happened many, many times at Cow Bay. We think it's flyby wasps. So after mansurf came TERN. So because I'd been able to run the mansurf project reasonably well, TERN was starting to shake around as a potential development. It was a federally funded initiative. And I ended up going down to a pivotal meeting down in Brisbane, I think, because the person from the Centre for Freshwater Research at the time, he'd put his foot in it a little bit when he'd gone down previously. So for some reason, they passed me the hat and said, can you go down to this next one? So all the main players were there. David Lindenmayer was there. And as soon as you saw David there, you knew that there was going to be money involved because he never wastes time on things unless there's going to be some money. So things started to get organised. And out of that, a concept that I'd put together, which was around this, basically the idea of that project, but scaled up to look at an ecosystem intensively. We called that a super site. Guys working with from CSIRO, Dan Metcalf down here. He was the deputy of the super site. We had Peter Grace in southeast Queensland doing the same thing for their site. It's called Surf, which is located in some sort of peri-urban landscape on the edge of Brisbane. So had a big team of people there involved with what was called a demonstrator super site. We needed to demonstrate it was a useful concept or not. This one focused on rainforest biodiversity. The other one focused on peri-urban environment. So we looked at a lot of things, but you can see some pretty familiar sort of flavours in here. But now we add some faunal monitoring. So Dave Westcott was looking at avian monitoring. We started to look at a little bit more in terms of the dynamics of the forest. So we've got Pete Green, who's involved with looking after some long-term dynamics plots. And on the mix, we did some remote sensing, and we specifically put physiology into the mix at that point. So that was successful. And because it was successful, we scaled up. So super sites then moved from demonstrator to an operational component of TERN funded by the federal government rather than Queensland government money, because this demonstrator thing was funded by the Queensland government as a buy-in, so that TERN was based in Brisbane. After the super site became funded as a TERN component itself. So we increased the number of sites progressively. And in 2018, this is where we'd sort of ended up with. Now you notice at this point here, a couple of the sites which were there at the start, the FNQ one back here, this had two nodes. It had an upland rainforest node and a lowland rainforest node in the Daintree. The Daintree one then involved the DRO in Cow Bay, and the Robson Creek was a new one. Over here, you'll see that the Daintree one has moved to an affiliate status because the Robson Creek site has been the one that's been funded, okay? So we couldn't keep funding two of the same thing in the same environment. It just was looking ridiculous in terms of how much coverage we've got through all the biomes of Australia. And so I didn't want to be seen to be the guy that was funding JCU on a non-scientific basis. Same thing down here. Peter Grace then established a new site, Mitchell Grass Rangeland, after I encouraged him to do so. But we turned this one into an affiliate site down here because it's a very ratty piece of remnant vegetation on the edge of Brisbane. You can't scale it to anything at all. Okay, just like the DRO, it's too close to the coast. We can't use remote sensing in the DRO. All you see is the sea. So stuff here had to make scientific sense. But that was my downfall, okay? I took out this one here, and this one here, TERN loves to show people, okay? And so what's next was the sad story of how this thing developed over the years. It became extremely successful, probably more successful than TERN. You know, at all the international meetings, everybody knew about super sites, and there was TERN as well, and that wasn't a good story for TERN. So at that point then because there were various generations of TERN, so we had TERN 1 right back at the start with the demonstrators. The only people left from that period are Alex, who's still there in CSIRO, so he's our sort of guru of remote sensing in Australia. Beryl, who had been the contracts person in TERN 1, but who's now the TERN director, and myself. But in 2017, we were doing budgets and things were looking pretty tricky. I wasn't really happy that we were going to move sort of into a stasis, you know, where we were growing fast and doing cool things. I didn't see the need for that. I decided that, you know, we needed to rationalise the science, so I made these affiliate sites. And so there was a meeting then at the DRO. This is the TERN board turning up at the DRO. You'll see Michelle here in the centre looking after them, Andrew behind her. So Andrew is the JCU representative of the on the TERN board. So they were there looking at how things sort of worked, and they made a passing comment, you know, they would never shut down this sort of stuff. It was just doing cool things. But while I presented in China in April 2018, I was the lead person from TERN talking at an international meet on research infrastructures. I got off the plane literally, and a day later, I got told that there was a gag order placed on me. I couldn't talk to anybody. Super sites were being shut down. Staff were handed to other people. So it was all like that. So TERN made a decision. JCU made a decision, but neither would agree that anybody had made a decision at all. It just happened. So out of that, I presented the last test talk on this. The key is making sure that you're balancing politics and money successfully. You know, I didn't balance those politics correctly, and that was my downfall at that point. TERN had to be super careful. That had a publication in Science where the fact that they'd shut down the LTR network in Australia had gone down very badly. Questions have been asked by the federal government about what exactly is TERN doing when you've got all these high-end scientists saying that, you know, we're shutting down long-term, high-value research. You know, these guys are phenomenal publishers, and that other network that was shut down. So that's why I had to shut things down very silently. So for me then, you've got to be careful. You've got to nod your head at the right moment rather than push real hard, as I tend to do. You still got to be resilient and you look for the next opportunity. So the DRO then at the start, Nigel and I decided we should register it as an LTR site, long-term ecological research station. So we did that. Tim Clancy, who moved on to become the TERN director, was then looking after LTR, so he was happy for that to happen. And that allowed us then to sort of put an umbrella over all the things that were happening. So I found this graphic over here that was involved with when the new DRO was being established, putting down the locations of significance on the site. So there's our site marked in black here. And what's sort of interesting to me is that, you know, beyond the stuff where we all usually work beside the creek and the crane, there's actually lots of other regions of high significance up there in the remnant sort of veg classes and stuff like that. So there's still lots of stuff we can all do up there, okay? Heaps and heaps of things. And lots of people are doing lots of different things. You know, you can see here, Yoko's been involved with the soil pits back in the day. We've got Roger Kitching looking at invertebrates. He's been a big player. We need to have more of these people keep coming back and keep doing all of these sort of things to keep LTR going up there. It has been the most intensively studied site in Australia for invertebrates in a 1 hectare site, but that amount of activity is not there, you know, that used to be there. And I'd like to see that sort of stuff sort of continue. So it got me into the LTR sort of framework. I worked with a lot of the guys then in the TERN network in TERN before it was shut down. So working with these really good scientists gave me a good view as to how to do stuff, but I'd worked on the tech side of things. So in ILTER, which is the international network that links all the LTRs around the globe together, I got involved to sit on the science steering committee, which I still do and like to contribute to. So our last meeting face-to-face was a while back now. Back in 2010, this is a vision that we had for how we might organise data. So just think this is 10 years back. How far have we come? Now, there have been some good moves in terms of getting the DRO more effective in terms of data, but there's still a long way to go. You know, we've now got fabulous buildings and stuff like that, but in terms of getting that, you know, putting all our data in the right places, making sure it's all organised, getting nice comms going that are stable, there's still a little way to go. Crane, though, with Andrew driving down here, remains a focal point of activities for the site. So other bits. Now, you know, that's the core stuff I've been involved with, but around the edges, you know, Ramina Rader here, who's an academic now down south, she was involved with looking at, with Andrew Krockenberger, soft and furries up in the canopy that used to eat through the aluminium traps here. Okay, so white tails will eat through anything. I've had plenty of experience of that. Cassandra took a nice shot of tree kangaroos up there. So, you know, I've been involved with putting in camera traps, keep an eye on things. We do re-veg work. When we're walking around, we all notice stuff up there, where it be weird snakes. Here I'm looking at water quality and bump into a couple of young cassowaries up there. Susan's drought has added so much energy to the site that wasn't there before. It really has made a massive difference. You know, we've got early versions of soil fluxes that I designed with that guy David back in the day, the physics guy. This is a piece of gear up here for measuring aerosols in the forest. So workplace health and safety would be horrified to see that we were running long pieces of cable with 240 volts straight from that donga into the forest about 100 metres and running one of these things in there to look at where aerosols are being formed in the forest, and we're looking at the volatiles behind it. Alex, who you can see in the insert here, has had a big involvement over the years. He's now looking at ozone. Here's an early ozone monitor that we had up there for another student looking at these volatile organic compounds. Had a bit to do with water over the years. Here's the weir going in. So up here you can see Hanshi talking to Nico and Yoko. Here's the sonde. Now, Nico's very practical, okay? So this is his design to put in the sonde. He's ended up sort of dynabolting it or whatever to this giant boulder here to prevent it going down a creek. And he knows that this will work, and that saves people money. So Michael Bird's early postdoc, Adrian, who was on the earlier paper, he had lots of issues with the storm surges that come down this creek, washing away gear. So the more you're in the field, the more valuable your experience can be to other people. So they had to blow up a bit of stuff. You can see here's the explosive truck coming in, mounting the explosives to take out the boulder that turns into these little bits here that gives us a useful sort of weir. What I'm up at the moment? Okay, so I was there then a couple of weeks ago. So at the moment we've got Carly, who's doing a PhD with Lucas, and I haven't put a picture of Lucas in here, but I'm working a lot with Lucas as well. So both Carly and Angelina are working on an experiment that's looking at heating of leaves and how that will influence their physiology in the future. So the insert here then is of a tree with these heater boxes placed around it, and you can see the leaf heater in here. There are fine wire thermocouples stuck to the bottom of the leaves. And what Christine, who's from down south at Western Sydney Uni, is trying to do is look at this effect of elevating the temperature of the leaves. So she's got controls, she's got heating experiments in place. Carly's going through, she's linking that to her PhD. We've got a FLIR camera image here, which is showing you the temperature of the leaves, and we're comparing that with the measured electronics. That is why we're involved in. So we helped put the electronics in. Back in the TERN days, I got involved with phenocams. We developed one from scratch, and with camera traps and with acoustic sensors. So there's a very early acoustic sensor that we put in with the guys that are now the gurus from QUT. So back in the day, we were putting an MP4 player in a box, okay, with some microphones. Nowadays, it moves to more commercial sort of hardware. Keeps me busy, you know, whether it's out on heights trying to fix electronic gear with Nico, as we were doing yesterday, and it keeps us publishing bits and pieces. You can see here there's a modelling paper that links to some other models that have been run up here, and this is the flux stuff, okay? So we had a paper with Jamie at the back there. They got published in Nature recently. That's using data from these sort of flux towers in the forests. So that's what I've been up to. That's what I'm up to at the moment, trying to help young researchers do stuff up there and keep the place busy. I've always got a lot of energy for the DRO. Certainly I intend to be there for a while longer. So thank you, everybody. And I hope that was pictorially, at least, if anything else interesting.